And what you just presented earlier, for me, I use that as an introduction. When I grew up academically, like 30 years ago, we were doing climate change biology, global change biology. That is, we observed a phenomenon in the environment and we studied what did it do to the biology. I think you showed just the opposite, and this is what we want to do here, the biology of climate change. What drives it and how can we use it to bring about sustainability, solutions for sustainability transitions. We've heard a huge bandwidth of interesting facts and information from molecular to species to whole system, even into the digital sphere, which is very, very interesting. And so I'd like to, without further ado, open this theme, this afternoon discussion for questions from the audience. First one here.
Hi, I'm Francis Albared. I have a question for the first two speakers, and I was wondering about the plasticity we could expect from the biomass and from the flux of carbon, given that actually the amount of biomass is limited. We have, for one atom of phosphorus, we have 105 atoms of carbon. So phosphorus comes from the rivers, probably iron comes from the wind or from the hydrothermal vents. So it doesn't look too much that we can actually play a lot with the amount of carbon which is actually stuck or produced in the ocean if we limit it by the nutrients.
Did you ask that specifically for Chris?
Yeah, both of them can probably answer that question.
Chris, you want to take a first shot?
Shall I go first? Yes, okay.
As you like.
Yes, thank you for raising that point. I mean, it's really related to the issue of fertilization of the ocean to try to improve its capacity to bring down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the ocean. And yes, you have to play with what is limiting in the ocean. In some areas it's phosphate, in other areas it's nitrate, in other areas it's iron. And phosphate is a special case that is, you know, we're slowly consuming all of our resources of phosphate. We're taking the phosphate from accessible sources in quarries on land, and that phosphate that is being used in agriculture, as you say, goes into the rivers, goes into the ocean, and ends up at the bottom of the ocean, and is basically extremely difficult to bring back out and recycle in today's society. So we're slowly consuming that phosphate. I think the time period under which that phosphate will be consumed is sort of hundreds, thousands of years. What is more of more direct concern in terms of fertilizing the ocean with limiting nutrients in order to improve its capacity to sequester carbon from the atmosphere is often concerning iron. Iron micronutrient is often limiting in vast regions of, in particular, the southern hemisphere. And it has been shown in some experiments that, yes, you add iron to the system. Iron will stimulate a phytoplankton bloom because iron is essential for photosynthesis. So the addition of iron will stimulate a phytoplankton bloom, which will bring carbon into the system that can be utilized by the food chain or can be taken to the bottom of the ocean. There were, I think, 13 large-scale, mesoscale iron fertilization experiments done in the 80s and 90s, which indicated that, yes, maybe it can work as a mitigation strategy to improve carbon sequestration in the ocean, or, you know, some of the results were somewhat equivocal, because the CO2 would be returned back to the atmosphere through decomposition, respiration, and so on. Because of the concerns about manipulating the ocean at this scale, the United Nations stuck a moratorium on those sorts of experiments. So we basically stopped doing those experiments like 20 years ago. Now, you know, this whole debate about fertilizing the ocean with, for example, iron is back on our priority list, and we need to assess it. But because of that moratorium, we basically lost 20 years of time where we could have done some mesoscale, some smaller scale experimentation to assess the impacts of that sort of manipulation. So we need to, you know, restart with caution. I think those sorts of small-scale experimentation and processes of fertilization to see how, you know, those sorts of approaches may be of interest for carbon dioxide removal in the ocean. Nature-based solutions include like mangroves, planting seagrasses to remove carbon dioxide. That's very good, but the surface area that you can use for those sorts of approaches are pretty limited, so you're not going to have a massive impact on carbon removal. So we probably, you know, should look to the open ocean of how we can maybe use the open ocean to help us to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But that needs to be done with caution. But we also need to move fairly quickly on assessing that.
Okay, thanks. 1, 2, 3 questions, please.
Okay. Yes. Thank you to all the speakers. My question is actually to Martin, but the other speakers, feel free to give your thoughts or reflections if you feel so. Martin, I'd like to apply your call for the use of digital twins to a specific case, which is the use of open water aquaculture. How can, from your perspective or from your experience, how can the use or the application of digital twins in the case of aquaculture, and specifically open ocean aquaculture, benefit the stakeholders? Thank you.
Excellent question. Yeah.
So that is a great question. It's one around how can we use our collective understanding in one part of the use of the ocean, increased use of the ocean, that's mariculture or aquaculture, and really thinking about that, what that means from a permitting point of view, from a sustainable operational point of view, and also an economic point of view. And I can give you a very concrete example of a digital twin application that is from Norway. It's the region of Tromsø, who is actually operating in close to a digital twin of the likes that I described. And their concern is that the mariculture activity there is about salmon farming, and the challenge is that you have certain lice, so that actually compromise, if not even fully destroy, the crop in the pen. And the region of Tromsø convinced the private sector actors that it is in their own interest to fund and install an observing system that gives them real-time information about the environmental condition within which they operate, but also real-time information about the feed that they're using, including the diseases of the fish. And the reason why the private sectors agreed to that is because they don't want to have, let's say, a rogue actor spread the lice to the other ones who are trying to do it sustainably. But you couldn't do it just by the industry, so you have to have regulators coming in. That's the permitting agencies of Norway. So they're using that digital twin approach to real-time managing, operation, and optimizing the outcome. What they're now thinking about is using the same technology of digital twins. How many more of those could you possibly build? And what would be the right spacing of them? What's the right loading of them? So issues around that. And I'm seeing in many other parts of the world that mariculture, open areas of even tuna farming in Cabo Verde, I heard some pilots around it, and many of them go without regulations, without environmental assessments, and I really urge all of the coastal states to don't go by that low law, but actually use the tools that we have before you employ and try out mariculture system, which could wreak havoc into your ecosystem. These are risky bits because they also pollute, depending on what feed you use, depending on what medicines you use, but digital twins can really help you to look at the full ecosystem's approach to it, but you need data around it. Quite often you don't have that. And my plea is always make those groups who want to make benefits from the ocean, that's quite often a private operator, give them a license to operate. In that sense, give them the demand that they have to do environmental assessments also in real time of where they're operating, using some of their economic gains to bring it back to the understanding and the proper management. This can be done. It depends on the willingness of the coastal state to do it. And I think it's also our job to communicate that to the world that this can be done.
Thank you. Troels, did you have a question?
Yes. My first comment was to Martin. I think you should stop the sound on the video and just do the voiceover yourself. That was fantastic. But this is really a question to the modelers. So, sorry, Chris and Martin, I guess, but I guess it's relevant to others as well. We've talked about trigger points in terms of the Antarctic ice shelves and the circulation of the Gulf Stream. So how is this going to affect the primary productions? Because we saw that was really significant at the poles. Are there any additional trigger points that we have to consider there?
So maybe I start and then Chris is the expert, right? So, I mean, what you're asking about is, in some sense, as we're warming the planet, as an example, we're doing it every year a bit more, unfortunately. But the question is the response of the environment as linear as the forcing is, or close to linear? And that is not so clear, because at times it looks pretty linear, and then you go over a hump and you come into a new balance system. And it can happen in the physics. We are concerned about some of these things like deep water formation. There could be a tipping point. We call that a regime shift. But I think in physics, they're maybe easier to delineate. We think there are potential for some of them, maybe feedbacks with ice melts and so on. But I happen to think that the shifts, or the more dramatic shifts, are easier to accomplish in the marine ecosystem. And of the area that you were talking about up in the Arctic, I mean, I'm not an expert on marine ecosystem, but Chris is. But I think, yes, we have some tipping points in the dynamics of the ocean circulation, the climate system. But I personally am actually more concerned about the ecosystem to respond to that, because we know that the ecosystem can flip into a different state of equilibrium. And I think Chris can be giving us some great examples of that.
Chris, you want to expand on that eventually?
Yeah, I think that you did a great job already to summarize the different issues there. Yes, I think that the tipping points are crucial. We need to understand more about what actually, where is the point of change in equilibrium of the system, of phase change in the system. I think physics can help us with that. I think theory can help us with that. And that's where I think theory is very important to add to the observations, the modeling that we've also talked about at this meeting. Yes, in terms of what may happen in the future, there's different kinds of scenarios. Some are more certain than the others. I think all of the models suggest that we're going towards an ice-free North Pole. By 2040, 2050. That's not tomorrow, but almost tomorrow, kind of scary. At least in the summertime, the ice will come back at the winter time, of course. That is going to have effects on the ecosystem for sure, because the under-ice ecosystem is very important, very rich, and essentially produces the energy that drives the whole ecosystem in the through the entire year, through the different seasons. So if we lose that within ice ecosystem, that's going to have important effects for the entire food chain, all the way up to the polar bears in the Arctic. The way that we are predicting things may happen is that some certain groups of phytoplankton will maybe benefit from the increased temperatures, from the changing situation, whereas others will suffer. It's difficult to say if that will result in a net increase or a net decrease in primary productivity, I think. But certainly the organism, the community of organisms will change. And that will affect the upper trophic layers, because, you know, all organisms, they have preferences for what they eat. Not only us, we like meat, we like fish, we like vegetables, whatever, but all, you know, organisms have preferences for what they eat. And so if that food source moves, then they will move with it. So that will affect the fishing industry, for example, directly for human society. And the nature of the ecosystem will also affect the carbon sequestration to deeper layers, as we've heard in several talks here. I think hopefully you've now got an appreciation that this sinking of carbon to the deep is incredibly important for the climate system. And whether it's a big particle, whether it's a small particle, whether it's a sticky particle, whether it's one kind of carbon over a different kind of carbon, right? You can say much more than I can. These have very important influences on that, the amount of carbon that ultimately makes it to the bottom of the ocean and gets sequestered for long periods of time. Okay. And that's going to have important effects on the climate system, I believe. Okay, let's move on. Another question. Guy, you were next.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thanks to the panelists. So I'd like to ask the panelists for their opinions on a broad issue. So this morning we had the panel on the age of biology, and we heard a lot about the ways in which biology provides, the study of living things provides us with tools that we can use to engineer and to intervene. We've heard amongst the scientific insights and the nuggets of knowledge that there are huge gaps in our understanding of how the oceans work. So my question is, how do we rationalize and balance these things? What do we prioritize?
Who wants to take a stab at that? You should go. Yeah, Astrid, you want to take?
I mean, to me, it also seems that there's currently still some understanding of some processes, but as you say, a very big lack of knowledge in others. And I think on one hand, it's very interesting to think about interventions that would be possible right now, but I think they also really come at the cost right now of not understanding a large part of processes. And it really poses the question, how well informed are we right now to make these interventions, like providing iron additionally to the ocean? And my current impression is really that it would be very hard to make a really well-funded and well-informed guess of what would be a good intervention. And I feel there are many historic examples of where human interventions went terribly wrong when we thought we understand an ecosystem and we...
Of course, I will plead for fundamental science, because I think that fundamental science always ends up feeding applied science, so that we know if we kill fundamental science today, there is no applied science in 50 years. This knowledge is, I mean, people said it this morning, yesterday as well, you never know what you will end up discovering. There are so many discoveries that have been made while people were not necessarily aiming at that. I can take one example. I spoke about molecular biology today, for example, the Taq polymerase. All the labs in the world use that polymerase. It was found by a guy that was studying thermophilic bacteria in Yellowstone, I think. And he just figured out that that enzyme was doing a much faster job than any other one that we knew of at least. So I think it's urgent. We need probably a mix of both applied science, fundamental science. We probably need a lot of investment at that, and I would probably just go back also to the slide from this morning on the economic perspective of COVID that Professor Fontane showed us. He also showed that actually taking mitigating measures was way more efficient economically than working afterwards. So this is not a loss of money, it's in everyone's interest.
Martin?
What I would think, using also the economic example, I mean, you asked a question about priorities, let's say, in research or science funding. I mean, in economy, you would say there's a lot of uncertainty. You guys just said that, right? So the approach in economy is, it's like venture capital. You don't invest on one company and hope it's going to go. You go for 100 companies and hope that 2 will be great. So I think what it basically says is there's a lot to be discovered. We don't know exactly which of these mechanisms that we heard will be really important. So on that basis, there's no rationale to say, let's go for that, right? I think you should go for funding the scientific enterprise in its totality, but do exactly what you guys said. In some areas, do synthesis and see whether some candidates. But I don't think that this community is ready to tell you we're all going to go that direction because the uncertainty is so high. So you have to take a venture capitalist approach. That is, you fund a lot of different things because you don't know the outcome. Science is not a plannable enterprise. It's different than production engineering.
Okay. So there was no, the lady behind you. She was first, yeah, or left of you, yeah, and then Andy.
Hi. So I would like to ask Martin in particular, what types of pollutants are more easy to include into
Speak up a little bit. Can you speak up a little bit?
Yes. Sorry, I would like to ask Martin in particular, what types of pollutants are the most easy to incorporate into your digital twins? And in particular, if you could comment about ocean plastic pollution, and maybe more broadly to all of you, if you have the impression this is a negligible problem or not at all, if there is scientific consensus on that issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm not a big expert on all the pollution areas, but I'll take two examples. You mentioned plastic. For example, in plastic it's so obvious because it's a man-made substance. There's no role to be in the ocean. 80% comes from land. It's pure waste management. But on the other hand, we can use digital twin type approaches to see, well, if we don't stop our emittance of plastic into the system, where will it land? What could it potentially do? But you can also use the same technique to go back to and identify where the pollution came from. You can also use that same model in the reverse mode. So I think that's one example of that. But digital twins come more in when you have multiple pollutants coming into a system and trying to understand what the collective stressors are on, let's say, ecosystem evolution, if you understood what that are. But plastic is an easier one to monitor. Maybe nutrients coming in from land is another area that's very concerning, has a lot of impacts, but there's other pollutants which are more effective on some organisms, less on others, which are much tougher to deal with. But I think the framework as such can help you at least to see how fast it is spreading, where is it going, but you can also do a backwards attribution, where's the source for a pollution, and then get to this polluter pay or call in responsibility. So there's opportunities in that space as well.
Okay, great. So there's 1, 2, and then 3. Andy, please.
Well, I think I was going to ask a very similar question, but let me just sort of broaden it out slightly and just say that obviously the oceans are being subjected to multiple stresses simultaneously. Pollution, obviously we've heard about microplastics, eutrophication, ocean acidification, warming, and so on. And I'm just wondering whether enough research is going on to understand the interactions between these multiple stresses. I mean, it's often true that we still tend to work rather narrowly on one at a time and wonder what work is going on across these different stresses. And a specific question to Astrid, I mean, there's a lot of bacterial loading coming in from coastal regions, from agricultural runoff, from sewage. Do we know anything about the impact of this bacterial load on the biological carbon pump, for example?
Should I start with question number 2?
To you, yeah.
Yes. I don't know so well about measurements about the bacteria that come from rivers or influxes into the ocean. I think where I know more about is looking at wastewater treatment plants and looking at bacteria upstreams and downstreams, which I think is a quite similar scenario. And I think that we find that a lot of bacteria do end up in the downstreams areas. I think, though, that major factors are still what food is available, what conditions are available that shape very strongly which bacteria we find. So I think there's no way how you can plant a tulip in the desert and it will survive. So I still think the environmental conditions are probably main drivers. But I think kind of the seeding and distribution of bacteria is also something to consider, yes, if that answers the question.
Yeah. Uri, you want to come in on that as well?
So I
specifically cannot say a lot about it, but I can say, because I don't know what's the role of bacteria that coming from land it's a good question by itself. I can say that the other side, so bacteria that come from the ocean, like Vibrio cholera, it's exactly the other side. And those actually bacteria that also has the type 6 secretion and the killing system that Astrid was talking about. So those interplay between land and the ocean are very interesting, and there is a lot of research that need to be done in this area, I would say.
Quick comment,
Yeah,
Martin?
I think it's a great question. Those multi-stressor approaches to the ecosystem is, for us as typical natural scientists, so tough, right? Because we like to do reductionalists. You go, oh, I can say something about nutrients. I know something about this. So we try to take the problem, bring it to home, to where I'm an expert on, and try to bring it to the lab and do a single stressor study. That's the normal approach, with reductionist approach to science. But that doesn't do justice to these multi-stressor challenges. Two problems there. First of all, you need multidisciplinary teams to look at that. That can be done. But second of all, doing clean experiments, that is really hard, right? So we're working something on these mesocosms, where you can do more than one stressor in a big of an isolated volume of ocean, but they're not so easy to attack with our typical questions, approaches that we have in science. So I think the bottom line is not that people don't want to do it, but it's kind of hard to do. And I would agree with you that this is the most challenging question that we have, and the reductionist approach that we're doing might not be the only way to make progress on that. There can also be meta-studies looking at comparative regions and so on that would help with that challenge. But it's a tough one for natural scientists to tackle with, because we like our reductionist approach.
Pavel?
I have two questions in one, if I may. So congratulations again for this fascinating discussion and panel. Obviously, the system which you described so eloquently is an extremely complex system. Data starved, we have no data. We have a fundamental uncertainties on biology, but also physics. I mean, physical climate modeling, of course, is something ocean we know about. Yet we are relying on models because of the very fact what I said, we have no data. Now, one of the best models here in France, I mean, Martin and I think Chris knows NEMO model, which is one of these world standard. If there was a one thing which you, coming from the fundamental marine biology and from the ocean physics, would do tomorrow to improve the skill of models like NEMO, what would it be? What would it be tomorrow? Suppose there is unlimited money available. Because I think that's something which is much more complex than the atmospheric ocean coupling, etc., etc. My second question is of the upper ocean. You know that currently in all the carbon balances we are calculating, which was today presented, we are relying on the ocean carbon sinks in order of 1 up to 2 gigaton. That's a lot, because we are emitting 11 gigaton every. That's a lot. Now, what is your best guess on how uncertain is this estimate? Can we have a surprise? Because 2 gigaton sink is a huge part of the emission, and we are counting on it in our scenarios. So what is your best guess on the upper ocean in terms of the sink in the order of 2 gigaton a year, roughly, which we are now using? Thank you.
Maybe start with the first question. Everyone, a short answer. What would you like to do tomorrow with unlimited funds? And then we address the second part. We'll take a tour. Astrid, you want to start?
Yes, unlimited funding. I'm a bit tempted to go to something similar. You said, Martin, that I think there's really this lack of understanding fundamental concepts, and we need a bit of a bad hedging strategy here of trying to identify the very important ones that are crucial to understand how they will react in the face of climate change or in the face of any interventions that people plan. So I find it hard to put my finger on one point to pick. I would rather go for exploring different gaps that we're currently failing to understand.
Good one. Yeah, Martin?
So I think on the NEMO question, that's an ocean circulation model. Those of you don't know that is, but I think there, Pavel, tackling or solving this issue, how can we combine these more deterministic dynamic models with AI and data learned system in a smart way? I think that would really open up new ways to tackle these complex issues. So that would be my short-term fix, really figuring out how technically that can be done to really infuse this data-based understanding of processes in a more classical, dynamical approach in forward calculation.
Audrey.
If I take it for the, I'll talk for the deep sea in this case. I think you mentioned earlier that we need more interdisciplinarity to understand how things work, and that's true that we need that, but always, reduction is sometimes limiting because we don't see all the co-effect that we can have, but on the other hand, to be able to build something that is very broad, we also need a fundamental knowledge. So for example, for the deep sea now, we've been a lot in terms of observing directly in the deep sea. We need to bring that science now to the lab and combining with the deep sea so that we can have both a reductionist approach where we can understand mechanism and at the same time understand how these mechanisms applies there. So I would go for cross-linking between the two.
Chris?
I would say that we need more observations in order to feed the models with, to improve their accuracy. To do that, because the ocean is fundamentally, you know, global and international, we need international funding, and one source of that can be the philanthropists who, you know, instead of pointing their rockets to outer space, could maybe think about the ocean, and through public-private partnerships, we could maybe, you know, gather more data to feed the models to improve them.
Aurea.
So I think we saw during those talks that the biological pump is an extremely important part of the carbon cycle, which is directly related to the amount of carbon dioxide that we have. And that's, I think it's looking through this magnifying glass and to understand what is going on in each one of those steps. It's extremely important in my eyes. And if I need to invest money, not that I can do that, but if one day I could, I would actually try to put my money in places in intermediate between the small scale and the big scale. So it's very hard to connect. Many times some people has observation in the lab and global scale biogeochemical modelers, they look at the big picture, and connecting the two scales is very, very hard. Yeah. So I think putting more effort in connecting those, the small and the big scale, that's where I see the field going.
Okay, I'd like to move on to our last question, please.
My question is for Audrey. I was wondering if you have an idea what is entraining the biological clock of the mussel at that depth, if you have an hypothesis, and based on your RNA-seq, if you find some gene ontologies which pop out at specific time points that can, let's say, give you an idea about the biological processes that are regulated in a circadian manner.
Thank you for this both technical and environmental question. So globally, I would say that the question that how the marine organisms perceive their environment is very poorly understood. What we know so far is mostly based on model terrestrial organisms, and when we do that in terms of entraining the clock, most of the time it's light in mice. That's what we know of. A little bit of temperature in some other models, also Drosophila. I mean, when I say light in mice, it's mice and Drosophila, let's be honest. And once we go beyond that, it starts to be very complicated to know how it works. Even for just shallow water species, we know very little about how they perceive their environment. What we know still is that globally it's probably species dependent, and that a lot of factors can play the role of what we call time giver. So this information from the environment that the organism can perceive and synchronize to. So depending on the species, I would still bet on temperature as a big one, because we know it's measured in all environments. So from an evolutionary perspective, it's probably a good bet, but it could be also pH, salinity. There are a lot of different options. From the RNA-seq data, I don't really have an insight yet, but what I can still just say that we identified so far the genes that are usually the potential clock genes, circadian clock genes in those species. So that's the clock similar to the one we have, and that allows us to work over 24 hours. What we still don't know is that clock is still functional. And I also want to say that globally in marine biology, besides the circadian clock, we don't know how the other clocks work. I mean, that's just true, in fact, not in marine biology, in biology in general. We know how the circadian clock works in mice, in flies, and once we go beyond that, whether the mechanism, we know others as well, but the mechanism can vary between species, and in marine species, everything that's related to tide, to lunar cycles and everything, we still don't have the mechanism for that yet. So it's very difficult to tell, but I would say short, probably different factors and we have the potential cloak genes, and we want to test if these genes are still functional in the deep sea as well. And if yes, how does that work? Because these environments are quite extreme. We are really near the limits of life, near what life can stand up or stand for, can support. So how does that work there? And I think this will also be very helpful for other model organisms afterwards.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome you in supporting our speakers and thanking our speakers for wonderful presentations this afternoon. Thank you for keeping on time. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much, guys.